5. Most evil women in the Bible. The dark side of history. The Bible is a book of incredible contrasts, stories of faith and stories of failure, tales of heroism and accounts of deep wickedness. It speaks of men and women who changed history, some through their devotion to God and others through their defiance of Him. Today, we're diving into the lives of 5 women whose names have become synonymous with danger, deception, and destruction. These women weren't just flawed. They were dangerously evil, using their influence to manipulate, betray, and even murder. And their actions left a trail of devastation that serves as a warning even today. You see, when we think about villains in the Bible, we often picture men: Pharaoh, King Saul, Judas Iscariot. But evil isn't limited to one gender. The Bible tells us of women who embraced darkness, who chose ambition over righteousness, power over mercy, and self-interest over obedience to God. Some were queens, wielding power with an iron grip. Others operated behind the scenes, using seduction, deceit, and manipulation to get what they wanted. Their choices didn't just affect them. They shaped the course of nations and even determined the fate of God's people. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear. None of these women were born evil. No one starts out as a villain. Sin creeps in little by little, twisting the heart, distorting the mind, until what once seemed unthinkable becomes second nature. And that's why their stories are so important. They aren't just historical accounts of wickedness. They are warnings. They remind us of what happens when pride goes unchecked, when greed takes over, when jealousy consumes, and when rebellion hardens the heart. These stories aren't just about them. They are about us. They show us what can happen when we let sin have control, and they force us to ask tough questions. Have we ever been like Jezebel, controlling, manipulative, unwilling to submit to God's authority? Have we ever been like Delilah, willing to betray someone for personal gain? Have we ever held on to bitterness like Herodias, or let power corrupt us like Athaliah? Have we ever told a lie to protect ourselves, like Potiphar's wife? If we're honest, we've all seen glimpses of these traits in our own hearts. Maybe not to the extreme, but the seeds of sin are there. The good news? God warns us through their story so we don't have to follow the same path. So today, as we walk through the lives of these 5 dangerous and evil women, don't just listen with curiosity. Listen with discernment. Let their mistakes open your eyes to the dangers of sin, and let their downfalls remind you that no one, no matter how powerful, escapes God's justice. But most of all, let their stories push you closer to God, to His wisdom, to His mercy, and to His righteousness. Because in the end, the real difference between a life of destruction and a life of blessing is the choice to follow Him. Are you ready? Let's begin. Number 1, Jezebel, the wicked queen of Israel. If there's one name in the Bible that has become synonymous with evil, manipulation, and rebellion against God, it's Jezebel. Even today, the name Jezebel is used to describe a woman who is cunning, ruthless, and morally corrupt. But who was she really? And why is she remembered as one of the most dangerous women in the Bible? Jezebel wasn't just any woman. She was a queen, the wife of King Ahab of Israel. She came from the powerful city of Sidon, a stronghold of Baal worship. Her father Ethbaal wasn't just a king. He was also a priest of Baal, a false god that demanded human sacrifices and led people into deep spiritual corruption. When Jezebel married Ahab, she didn't just bring her beauty and political alliances. She brought her gods, her idolatry, and her ruthless hunger for control. From the moment she stepped into Israel's history, Jezebel made it her mission to replace the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Baal. And she didn't just introduce Baal worship, she enforced it. She had God's prophets slaughtered, replacing them with her own priests. She silenced those who opposed her, ensuring that her influence spread unchecked. Ahab, weak and easily controlled, followed her lead, making Israel sink deeper into sin. One of the most infamous moments of Jezebel's reign was her ruthless plot against Naboth. Naboth was a simple man who owned a vineyard near the palace. Ahab wanted it for himself, but Naboth refused to sell it, honoring God's law that forbade him from giving away his ancestral land. Ahab, sulking like a spoiled child, went to Jezebel, and Jezebel, with no regard for justice, had Naboth falsely accused of blasphemy and stoned to death. With Naboth out of the way, she handed the vineyard to Ahab as if it were a mere business transaction. Jezebel thought she could do as she pleased. She thought she could silence God's people and get away with it. But God saw everything. He sent the prophet Elijah to confront Ahab, delivering a chilling prophecy. Jezebel would face a gruesome end. She would die, and her body would be eaten by dogs. Years passed, and judgment finally came. Jezebel's reign of terror ended when Jehu, God's chosen instrument of justice, rode into the city. Even in her final moments, Jezebel tried to hold on to power. She painted her face, adorned herself, and looked out from her window with arrogance. But it was too late. Jehu commanded her servants to throw her down from the palace walls. Her body hit the ground, and moments later, horses trampled over her. When they went to bury her, they found only her skull, feet, and the palms of her hands. The dogs had devoured the rest, just as Elijah had prophesied. Jezebel's story is a terrifying reminder of what happens when a person hardens their heart against God. She had power, influence, and opportunity, but she used it all for evil. She led a nation into idolatry. She silenced those who spoke the truth. She thought she was untouchable, but in the end, God's justice prevailed. And here's the warning for us. Jezebel's spirit is still alive today. Not in a literal sense, but in the form of manipulation, rebellion, and the rejection of God's authority. Have we ever tried to control situations instead of trusting God? Have we ever compromised our faith for power, influence, or personal gain? Have we ignored God's warnings, thinking we could escape the consequences? Jezebel's story reminds us that no one is beyond God's judgment, but it also reminds us to turn back while there is still time. Jezebel chose rebellion. She chose destruction. We don't have to. Number 2. Delilah, the betrayer of Samson. Some of the most dangerous people in history didn't wield swords or command armies. Some destroyed lives with nothing but charm, deception, and betrayal. And few figures in the Bible embody this more than Delilah. She wasn't a queen like Jezebel, nor did she hold political power like Athaliah, but her ability to manipulate and seduce brought down one of the strongest men in history, Samson. Samson was no ordinary man. He was chosen by God before birth to be a Nazirite, set apart for a divine purpose. From the moment he was born, God's hand was on him, blessing him with supernatural strength. He tore apart a lion with his bare hands, struck down 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, and carried the gates of a city on his shoulders. He was unstoppable, except when it came to one weakness: women. Samson had a history of making poor choices when it came to love. But no mistake would cost him more than his relationship with Delilah. The Bible tells us in Judges 16 that Samson fell in love with her, but we're never told if she loved him back. What we do know is that the Philistine rulers saw an opportunity. They hated Samson because he had been a constant threat to them, and they desperately wanted to know the secret of his strength so they could defeat him once and for all. They approached Delilah with a deal. Find out how to weaken Samson, and they would each pay her 1,100 pieces of silver. It was a fortune. And Delilah didn't hesitate. What happens next is one of the most famous acts of betrayal in history. Delilah went to Samson, using charm and emotional manipulation to get what she wanted. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she asked him. But Samson, at first, toyed with her. He gave her false answers, first saying that fresh bowstrings would weaken him, then new ropes, then weaving his hair into a loom. And each time, Delilah tested his words, calling the Philistines to capture him while he slept. But each time, he broke free. Now, you would think that after this pattern repeated itself, Samson would realize Delilah's true intentions. But that's the dangerous power of manipulation. Delilah didn't give up. She pressed him day after day, nagging, pleading, accusing him of not truly loving her. And Samson, worn down, finally gave in. He told her the truth. His strength came from his dedication to God, represented by his uncut hair. That night, Delilah knew she had won. She lulled Samson to sleep on her lap, then called a man to shave off his 7 locks of hair. When the Philistines attacked, Samson tried to fight back, but this time his strength was gone. The presence of God had left him. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and threw him into prison. The mighty warrior of Israel was now a blind, humiliated slave. Delilah disappears from the story after this. She took her silver and vanished, leaving Samson to suffer the consequences of his weakness. And what a heavy price he paid. Delilah's story is a chilling reminder of the power of deceit and betrayal. She didn't need an army to defeat Samson, just words, persistence, and a heart set on selfish gain. She sold out the man who loved her, proving that some of the greatest dangers in life don't come from open enemies, but from those we trust the most. And this isn't just Samson's story, it's ours too. How many times have we let temptation whisper in our ears, slowly wearing us down until we give in? How often do we ignore warning signs because our hearts lead us in the wrong direction? Delilah teaches us that not everyone who smiles at us has good intentions. She reminds us to be careful who we let close to our hearts. And most importantly, she shows us the tragic consequences of ignoring God's wisdom. Samson lost everything because of Delilah's betrayal. But even in his downfall, his story wasn't over. In his final moments, he turned back to God, and God gave him one last burst of strength to bring judgment on the Philistines. Samson's life ended in redemption. But Delilah? She faded into history, a woman whose name became a symbol of betrayal. Her story leaves us with a warning. Be wise about who you trust, guard your heart, and never trade the calling of God for the empty promises of the world. Number 3. Athaliah, the bloodthirsty queen. Some villains operate in the shadows, manipulating events from behind the scenes. Others rise to power with blood on their hands, leaving no doubt about the depths of their wickedness. Athaliah was the latter. She wasn't just a queen. She was a ruthless tyrant who killed her own family to seize the throne of Judah. Of all the wicked women in the Bible, she was one of the most dangerous because of the sheer destruction she caused. Athaliah was the daughter of Jezebel, and like her infamous mother, she was steeped in idolatry, corruption, and ambition. She married Jehoram, the king of Judah, in what was likely a political alliance between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. But instead of bringing unity, Athaliah brought the poisonous influence of Baal worship into Judah, leading the people further away from God. Her true evil was revealed after the death of her son, King Ahaziah. Normally, when a king died, his son or another rightful heir would take the throne. But Athaliah had no intention of giving up power. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She ordered the murder of all royal descendants, including her own grandsons, to eliminate any potential threats to her reign. It was an act of unspeakable cruelty, one that showed just how far she was willing to go to satisfy her thirst for power. For 6 years, Athaliah ruled Judah with an iron fist. She reinforced Baal worship, desecrated the temple of God, and did everything she could to erase any trace of the true faith. She thought she had wiped out the entire royal bloodline, ensuring that no one could challenge her. But she made one fatal mistake. She missed someone. Unbeknownst to Athaliah, one of her grandsons, a baby named Joash, had been rescued. His aunt Jehosheba had hidden him away in the temple of God, where he was raised in secret by the high priest Jehoiada. For 6 years, Joash remained hidden, growing up under the care of faithful priests while Athaliah continued her wicked rule. Then came the moment of reckoning. When Joash was 7 years old, Jehoiada the priest made his move. He gathered the commanders, the Levites, and the people of Judah, and revealed the hidden king. They anointed Joash, placed the crown on his head, and declared him the rightful ruler. The people rejoiced, blowing trumpets and shouting praises to God. Athaliah heard the commotion and rushed to the temple, only to see the boy king standing there, surrounded by his guards. Realizing that her reign was over, she screamed in fury, tearing her clothes and shouting, "Treason! Treason!" But it was too late. The people had turned against her. Jehoiada ordered the guards to seize her, and they dragged her out of the temple and executed her. With Athaliah's death, Judah was finally freed from her tyranny. The people tore down the temple of Baal, destroyed its altars, and returned to the worship of the one true God. Joash became king, and for a time, the nation was restored. Athaliah's story is one of unchecked ambition, a hunger for power that led her to commit unimaginable atrocities. She wasn't content with influence. She wanted absolute control, and she was willing to destroy her own family to get it. But in the end, her reign was short-lived, and her wickedness was her undoing. Her life stands as a stark warning. Power without righteousness leads to destruction. Athaliah thought she could secure her throne through bloodshed, but God had other plans. Her evil was exposed, her reign was overturned, and her name became a symbol of cruelty and corruption. And here's the lesson for us. When we chase after power, influence, or success without considering God's will, we are setting ourselves up for disaster. Athaliah teaches us that no matter how much someone tries to fight against God's plan, His justice will always prevail. It may take time, but in the end, righteousness will rise and evil will fall. So the question is, are we living for temporary power, or are we walking in obedience to God? Because as Athaliah's story shows, no throne, no position, no worldly success is worth the price of a hardened, rebellious heart. Number 4. Herodias, the woman who demanded John the Baptist's head. Some people let pride and resentment take root in their hearts until they become consumed by hatred. Herodias was one of those people. She wasn't a queen like Jezebel or Athaliah, but her influence was just as deadly. Her story is one of unchecked bitterness, a grudge so deep that it led to one of the most shocking and gruesome executions in the Bible, the beheading of John the Baptist. Herodias was a woman who lived for power, status, and personal gain. She was originally married to Herod Philip, the brother of Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. But that marriage wasn't enough for her. She left Philip and married his brother, Herod Antipas, an act that was both immoral and unlawful according to Jewish law. It was a scandalous relationship, one that defied God's commands and set the stage for the darkness that would follow. Enter John the Baptist. John was a prophet, a man of God who fearlessly spoke the truth. He had no interest in pleasing kings or avoiding controversy. And when he saw Herod and Herodias living in open sin, he didn't stay silent. He publicly condemned their adulterous marriage, calling them to repentance. Herodias was outraged. How dare this wild prophet challenge her? How dare he expose her sin? She wanted him dead. But there was a problem. Herod Antipas, for all his flaws, was afraid of John. He knew John was a righteous man, and he actually enjoyed listening to him, even if he didn't always understand or accept his words. So while he had John arrested and imprisoned, he stopped short of executing him. But Herodias wasn't satisfied. She wanted John silenced permanently. And she knew exactly how to get what she wanted. An opportunity came during Herod's lavish birthday banquet. The room was filled with powerful men, officials, military commanders, and nobles. And then came the moment that sealed John's fate. Herodias' daughter Salome performed a seductive dance that pleased Herod so much that he made a reckless promise. "Ask me for anything you want, and I will give it to you, up to half my kingdom." Salome, coached by her mother, made her request. "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Herod was trapped. He didn't want to kill John, but he had made his promise in front of his guests, and he cared more about saving face than doing what was right. So, he gave the order. A soldier was sent to the prison, and moments later, John the Baptist was dead. His head was brought in on a platter and given to Salome, who handed it to her mother. Imagine the satisfaction Herodias must have felt in that moment. She had won. The man who exposed her sin was gone. She had silenced the voice of truth. But did she really win? History tells us that Herodias and Herod Antipas didn't live happily ever after. Their ambition and cruelty eventually led to their downfall. They were exiled to a distant land, stripped of their power, and faded into obscurity. John the Baptist, on the other hand, was honored by Jesus himself as the greatest of all prophets. Herodias' story is a terrifying example of how bitterness, pride, and revenge can destroy a person. She wasn't just angry at John. She refused to repent. Instead of humbling herself, she doubled down on her sin, letting hatred dictate her actions. And in the end, her legacy became one of shame and disgrace. So what can we learn from Herodias? First, unchecked pride and bitterness are dangerous. When we refuse to deal with sin, it hardens our hearts and leads us further into darkness. Second, silencing the truth doesn't change reality. Herodias thought that by killing John, she could silence God's message. But the truth remained, and her life still ended in ruin. And finally, her story reminds us to listen when God calls us to repentance. We all have moments when God convicts us, through His word, through others, or through our own conscience. The question is, will we respond in humility, or will we fight against Him like Herodias did? Because in the end, No one wins a battle against God. Number 5. Potiphar's wife, the false accuser. Some of the most dangerous people in history aren't the ones who wield swords or command armies. Sometimes the greatest harm is done by those who twist the truth, who use deception to destroy the innocent. And one of the most infamous examples of this in the Bible is Potiphar's wife, a woman whose name isn't even recorded, yet whose false accusation nearly cost a righteous man his future. Her story takes place in Egypt during the time of Joseph. Now, if you know anything about Joseph, you know he had a life filled with betrayal and hardship. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, he found himself in the household of Potiphar, a high-ranking Egyptian official. But despite his circumstances, Joseph remained faithful to God. He worked diligently, and because of his integrity, Potiphar trusted him completely, placing him in charge of everything he owned. But there was one problem: Potiphar's wife. She was a woman of power, a woman who was used to getting what she wanted. And what she wanted was Joseph. The Bible tells us that Joseph was well-built and handsome, Genesis 39:6, and Potiphar's wife became obsessed with him. Day after day she pursued him, trying to seduce him, trying to get him to sleep with her. Now, let's stop and think about this for a moment. Joseph was a young man. He was a slave in a foreign land, far from home. He could have given in. He could have justified it. After all, who would know? Who would care? But Joseph wasn't just any man. He was a man of God. And he knew that giving in wouldn't just be a betrayal of his master, it would be a sin against God. So he refused. Every time she tempted him, he resisted. He didn't entertain the thought, didn't flirt with danger. And then came the moment of ultimate testing. One day when Joseph was working inside the house alone, Potiphar's wife grabbed him by his cloak and demanded that he sleep with her. But Joseph did what every believer should do when faced with temptation. He ran. He didn't argue, didn't try to reason with her. He literally fled, leaving his cloak behind. And that's when her lust turned into fury. Humiliated and rejected, Potiphar's wife decided that if she couldn't have Joseph, she would destroy him. She screamed, calling the servants and claiming that Joseph had tried to assault her. And when her husband returned, she doubled down on the lie, showing him Joseph's cloak as proof of her false story. Potiphar was enraged. And even though he may have suspected that his wife wasn't telling the full truth, after all, if he had truly believed her, Joseph would have been executed on the spot. He still had Joseph thrown into prison. Imagine what that must have felt like for Joseph. He had done the right thing. He had honored God. And what was his reward? Chains. A prison cell. A false accusation that ruined his reputation. But here's the powerful part of the story. Joseph's suffering wasn't the end. Even in the darkness of prison, God was with him. And in time, Joseph's faithfulness led him to a greater destiny. He was elevated from the lowest place to the highest, becoming second in command over all of Egypt. He went from being falsely accused to being the very one who would save nations from famine. Potiphar's wife thought she had destroyed Joseph. But in the end, her deception didn't win. Truth prevailed. God's plan could not be stopped. So what can we learn from her story? First, we see the devastating power of lies. A single false accusation can ruin lives, destroy reputations, and cause deep injustice. Second, we are reminded of the importance of integrity. Joseph's refusal to compromise, even when no one was watching, is an example for all of us. And finally, Potiphar's wife reminds us that while deception may seem to win for a time, it never wins in the end. God is just. He sees everything, and he always brings the truth to light. So the question is, when faced with temptation, will we stand firm like Joseph? And when injustice comes our way, will we trust that God is still in control? Because as Joseph's story shows, even when the world falsely accuses us, God's truth always has the final word. The final warning: choosing righteousness over destruction. The stories of Jezebel, Delilah, Athaliah, Herodias, and Potiphar's wife are not just ancient tales of wickedness, they are powerful warnings for us today. These women were not born evil, but their choices led them down dark paths. They embraced deception, manipulation, ambition, and pride, and in the end, every one of them faced destruction. Their lives serve as reminders of what happens when sin takes control, and their downfalls prove that no one escapes God's justice. Jezebel's lust for power and her relentless idolatry brought judgment upon herself and her family. She thought she could erase God's truth, but in the end she was devoured by dogs, just as the prophet Elijah had foretold. Delilah used seduction and betrayal to bring down Samson, but her story ends in silence, while Samson, even in his death, was redeemed by God. Athaliah's thirst for the throne led her to slaughter her own descendants, but God preserved a rightful king, and she met a violent death at the hands of those she once ruled. Herodias let bitterness and pride consume her, manipulating her own daughter into demanding the death of John the Baptist. But while John's legacy endures, Herodias faded into disgrace, and Potiphar's wife, whose false accusations sent Joseph to prison, ultimately failed to stop God's plan. Joseph rose to power, and truth prevailed. These women made their choices, and they suffered the consequences. But we still have time to choose differently. Will we allow sin to control us, or will we surrender to God? Because in the end, His justice, His truth, and His righteousness will always have the final word.